Welcome. My name is Devorah Margolin, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow here at the program on Extremism, and thank you all for being here today. I'm joined by Dr. Aaron Zelin, who is the Richard Borrow Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, visiting research scholar at Brandeis University, and the founder of the widely cited website Jihadology, and also its podcast Jihad Pod. If you haven't checked these out, I highly recommend that you do. He's also the author of a recently published book, Your Sons Are at Your Service, Tunisia's Missionaries of Jihad, and the whole reason we are here today. Aaron's book is a tool to help you better understand the origins and nature of North African terror networks. It does this by examining Tunisia's history of involvement in jihadi movements and offers an in-depth examination of the reasons why so many Tunisians have been drawn to jihad following the 2011 revolution. It highlights the long-term causes and the effects of jihadi recruitment in Tunisia, including the prior history of Tunisians joining jihadist movements around the world and playing key roles in far-flung parts over the past 4 decades. And with no further ado, since you're not here for me, I will invite Aaron up to the stage, and I also would like to remind you that in the back, right here at the table behind you, we have 30% off Aaron's book. If you haven't purchased it already, I highly recommend you pick this up and get a discount code. Aaron, thank you.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. I know it's a little bit early on a Monday morning, starting off the week listening about jihadism in Tunisia, so I appreciate that. And thanks for the kind introduction and the program on Extremism for hosting me today. So the main reason I started this book was that I essentially wanted to understand why there was this growth and this force in the amount of Tunisians that became involved in jihadism after the revolution in 2011. At the time, most people thought it was very much a niche topic, and even today it is in some ways, just because it's not necessarily the epicenter of the jihadi movement. But it became even more relevant as I was going through my research, because people started to realize that there were a bunch of Tunisians involved with the Islamic State and involved in foreign fighting in Syria as well. So it expanded in terms of interest in that regards. So today I'm going to do something interesting and sort of look at this movement through the lens of the group's leader that started after the revolution, Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia. The individual's name is Abu Ayyad al-Tunisi, but he also went by the name Abu Sufyan when he was based in London for a time, and Abu Muhammad when he was based in Afghanistan. The reason I'm doing this is because actually last week, AQIM put out a video confirming that he was killed after about a year since he was originally reported to be killed in February 21st, 2019. So I thought it would be an interesting way of structuring this talk, just because he's in many ways probably the most important figure in the history of the movement. So you can sort of look at the history through what he did, even if he wasn't involved in every single aspect of it, but it did have consequences. And what's interesting about the AQIM video is that it actually noted for the first time publicly that Abu Ayyad was part of the AQIM's Shura Council, which hadn't been done previously. So to do this research, just to talk about it at first, just because it took a long time, I was able to derive from a lot of Arabic biographies and magazines from the jihadi movement going back to the 1980s. And this was a way to piece together a lot of the details, because I think a lot of people, generally speaking, have an idea sort of what was going on over the last 8 or 9 years, but a lot of the stuff prior to 2011 is shrouded in mystery, or just many people haven't looked into it. But because of this, Tunisians were actually a lot more involved in the movement before then than people realized. From the anti-Soviet jihad in Afghanistan to sort of this attack in Mali in 2011, during the actual uprising against Ben Ali, Tunisians had been involved with the jihadi movement for 30 years prior to this uprising. So during this period, you also saw a lot of Tunisians involved in attacks and plot networks related to things going on in the West. So I was able to derive a number of information too, in helping triangulate that through court documents in a number of these countries in a variety of languages. In addition to this, I actually had the opportunity to go onto the ground in Tunisia a few times and talk to members of Ansar al-Sharia, going to their rallies, going to their mosques, getting their Dewa literature. And these are pictures that I took when I was actually within the country itself. One of the good things about when you're in the countries, you can sort of get the feeling and the mood of what things were like. So for those that don't know Arabic, this says Obama, Obama, Kulna, Osama, or we are all Osama. In regards to Obama, Barack Obama. So you could sort of feel the brazenness in many ways that these guys had, and the openness with which they felt comfort in showing that they were part of this broader Al-Qaeda movement at this time, which you can't just get necessarily from looking at the primary sources, even if they were such a great, useful resource in deriving a lot of information for this book. And part of this is based off of the primary sources themselves from Ansar al-Sharia. And this picture I find kind of meta in some ways, because it's a picture of somebody about to take a picture of the caravan of people while they're about to go do some relief or charity efforts in a part of Tunisia at the time. And the thing is that based on just a 2.5-year period, Ansar al-Sharia actually released about 18,000 pieces of propaganda, pictures, magazines, statements, etc., videos over that time. So there was a rich resource in being able to derive and understand what was going on in a variety of locales within Tunisia. And so the Tunisians were not sort of mere footnotes within the history of the movement of the jihadi movement. They played important roles as foreign fighters in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Algeria, as well as Iraq. And this is actually on the screen the first martyrdom notice for a Tunisian that died in Afghanistan in the 1980s. There are key cogs in logistics, facilitation, and recruitment networks based in Europe, operating mainly out of Milan, but also in Paris, Brussels, and London. And then Tunisians had varying leading roles in large-scale attacks, including the 98 embassy attacks in Africa, Ahmed Shah Massoud assassination, the 9/11 attack, Jerba synagogue bombing, the Casablanca bombings, and the Madrid train bombings, as well as other plots that were thwarted over time. And many central figures that became leaders in either Ansar al-Sharia or later on with the Islamic State gained a bevy of experiences in the 30 years prior to the actual revolution. And one of these figures is, of course, Saif Allah bin Hassin, better known as Abu Ayyad, we'll get into in a second, but also people like Sami Yassib bin Khamis, who was in charge of the network in Milan, his deputy Mahdi Kamoun, Muaz al-Fazani, who was involved in Al-Qaeda's chemical weapons program in the late 90s and early 2000s, who then became a senior leader within the Islamic State in Libya, Hassan al-Brik, who was a part of the facilitation network in Syria for foreign fighters to join up with Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Zarqawi network after the U.S. invasion. And people like Abu Bakr al-Hakim, who was one of the first foreign fighters to join up with Zarqawi's network in Iraq. But then later on, after he was arrested and sent back to France, he helped mentor the guys that did the Charlie Hebdo attacks, obviously about a decade later. And then Abu Bakr al-Hakim then ended up, after the Tunisian Revolution, joining up with Ansar al-Sharia, being involved with its military wing that was based in Libya, and actually was the one who assassinated one of the politicians that was killed in 2013, and I'll get to that in a little bit. And you had Tariq al-Harzi, who became the head of the Islamic State's foreign fighter recruitment all the way back in 2007, 2008, in its earlier iteration before it was called the Islamic State, up until he was killed in 2015 by the U.S. in a drone strike. Then you had Sabri Yassid, who became a mentor for Muhammad Mira because they are half-brothers, but then later on ended up joining up with ISIS in Syria and was part of the propaganda there. You had people like Mohammed Bakhti and Wanas al-Faqih, who were part of this low-level insurgency that happened in Tunisia in late 2006, early 2007, called the Suleiman Group. Bakhti ended up being involved in sort of the culture war aspect of things after the revolution in terms of trying to get universities to allow women to wear the niqab in class. But Bakhti then ended up also being involved in the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Tunis in September 2012. And then Wanas al-Faqih was just a cleric within the AST religious system. And then later on, after the designation of Ansar al-Sharia in August 2013, ended up joining up with AQIM in Niger until he was arrested there and then sent back to Tunisia. Now he remains imprisoned. But before I get into the specifics of this movement, I think it's important to get a little historical context. So the founding president of Tunisia in 1956 was Habib Bourguiba, and one of the things he was involved in was a series of Islamic reforms in the late 1950s to late 1960s that led to a backlash from sort of conservative elements within society. And as you see here, this video is Bourguiba in the streets taking off women's veils, and this happened a number of times to sort of show this different era, but you could see those that were obviously believing within society, this is an affront to them in many respects. So this in turn, created the indigenous Islamist movement. They were led by Ennahda, though, before they had various different names of the group until they have their most recent name. As noted by Rashid Ghanouchi, who's been sort of the head of this movement, he said at the time, quote, "I'm of the generation of Zaytuna students during the early years of independence. I remember we used to feel like strangers in our own country, and Zaytuna was a religious institution in Tunisia." So over time, the Islamist movement's growth and successes became a threat to the power of both Bourguiba as well as his successor Ben Ali. This led to eventual hardcore arrests by members of Ennahda, and many of them ended up fleeing to Europe. And one of the individuals that actually got caught up in this was Abu Ayyad himself, who, according to his wife, was actually arrested for 2 years in 1987 for being involved in Ennahda's student movement at the time. After his 2-year imprisonment in 1989, he then went to Morocco to study law for 3 or 4 years. But then afterwards, he then made it to London in early 1994. And that's where he first got involved in the jihadi movement. And one of the things to note is that although there were Tunisians that did fight in Afghanistan, the movement that started to build itself up in Europe in the early to mid-90s is really where things started to crystallize in many respects for the Tunisians in particular. Unlike, say, maybe the Egyptians or Saudis or Yemenis who were more involved in the 1980s. So he quickly became an understudy of the Jordanian Palestinian Abu Qatada al-Filistini in London, who arrived only a few months before him in September 1993. And in this release here, which is a graphic of the release that Abu Qatada put out in January 2014, he noted of his student, quote, "He is among the best of those I have known in intellect and estimation of matters, and is most knowledgeable of people of my intentions, for he was the closest of people to me." So you could see that this relationship was very close, and he thought dearly of Abu Ayyad, and this is one of the reasons why you started to see a rise in many respects of Abu Ayyad within the movement, even if many people at the time didn't really know who he was. In Europe, he would get connected to other people like Tariq Maroufi, who was based in Brussels, as well as Sami Assi bin Khamis in Milan, both are Tunisians. And this is where, in many respects, the Tunisians started to hone their organizational skills and gain more experiences in the broader movement, especially in relation to facilitation, logistics, recruitment, fundraising, and forgery of documents. Because the movement prior to this point was actually not in the best of straits. As Abu Musab al-Suri said about this movement in the 1980s, quote, "Unfortunately, and despite having many faithful and good members among them, the reputation of the Tunisian brothers among the Mujahideen groups in general became that of a scattered group with a less than perfect image." So this would change throughout the 1990s as these guys got more involved and became crucial parts of these networks. In many ways, the rise of many of these figures, including Abu Ayyad, happened in the aftermath of a series of arrests that the French did, but also a number of European countries did in the mid-90s after the GIA plotted and or conducted a number of attacks in Europe. And the GIA, for context, was the jihadi group that was fighting against the Algerian government in the Algerian Civil War in the 1990s. So as a result, many of these individuals started becoming in more senior level positions within this broader European network. As a result, Abu Ayyad became a close confidant of the GSPC's representative in London in 1998, Rashid Boukhalfa. And similarly, because of this, both Abu Ayyad then, as well as bin Khamis in Milan, were helping send Tunisian recruits to Algeria to fight with the GSPC in the reorganized group, which was essentially a successor to the GIA after the excessive abuses that essentially the GIA did in the same way that we've seen with ISIS more recently. Through these connections with Abu Qatada, both Abu Ayyad and Abu Doha then got connected to the networks that were building up in Afghanistan again after the Taliban took control in 1996. And in the late 1990s and 1999 in particular, Abu Ayyad ended up moving to Afghanistan to be in charge of the Tunisia house in Jalalabad. He actually shared a house in Jalalabad with Jamal Belghal, who's a French Algerian, who actually was also another mentor before the Charlie Hebdo attackers later on. So you can see how in many ways there is this diversity of connection and embeddedness in many respects between a lot of these various networks. And what happened in Afghanistan is that you then had the creation of the Tunisian combatant group in June 2000 alongside Tariq Maroufi, though Maroufi stayed in Brussels and was sort of involved in the European and logistics and facilitation side of things, whereas Abu Ayyad was involved in what was going on in Afghanistan. Obviously, I know this is a complicated org chart, but I figured I'd put it in here just for context. And it's actually in the book itself, so if you get the book, you can look at it more closely and see who these figures are, and also get into what the roles were specifically of these individuals in the book. So as context, at the founding, there were at least 10 individuals present, and by the time the group was more robust, it had a little more than 20 people. So it wasn't like a large jihadi group. So again, these guys weren't that big compared to, say, other organizations at the time, like the Egyptians. But the TCG became most famous for planning the assassination of Ahmed Shah Massoud, who was the leader of the Northern Alliance 2 days prior to 9/11, and they did this with Abu Hafs al-Masri, who was essentially the military chief of Al-Qaeda at the time. And dressed up and pretending to be journalists interested in interviewing Massoud, the Tunisians Abdel Sattar Dahmani and Urawi al-Awar conducted the operation by planting a bomb in the camera that they had, which they stole from a France 3 network crew, and it exploded it by allegedly saying, I don't know if this is true or not, but it's a story that people tell, they said, quote, "Commander, what are you going to do with Osama bin Laden when you have conquered Afghanistan?" So it's kind of trolling them in some regards. And what's interesting about this network, especially related to the assassination of Massoud, is that it showed sort of the connectedness of this broader TCG network between Afghanistan, which was written about by Dahmani's wife, Malika al-Arud, in her book here. And she essentially said that prior to his travels to Afghanistan, from Brussels, Dahmani studied Manhaj, or Islamic methodology, with Abu Qatada in London between May and August 2000. And during this trip, he also got a letter of introduction to interview Massoud via the Gamal Islamiyah member Yasser al-Suri, which is an Egyptian jihadi group in the 90s. And when applying to be a journalist and getting visas in Pakistan, Dahmani and Awar received them from stolen passports via Maroufi in Brussels, who had procured them via the Milan-based network, which was involved in forgery from Fadl al-Saadi, who ended up actually being one of the first suicide bombers in Iraq after the U.S. invasion. So in the aftermath of 9/11, of course, many individuals within this movement were either killed or they scattered. And a number of them, especially those from North Africa, actually fled to Istanbul, and that's where they started to rebuild their networks. So in February 2002, top leaders from the Libyan, Moroccan, and Tunisian jihadi networks met to discuss sort of the prospects for bringing jihadi attacks back to Western countries in which they had previously resided. And based off of Spanish court documents, some of the ones that I showed earlier in the presentation, Abu Ayyad was actually involved in some of the early planning of both the Casablanca attack as well as the Madrid train bombings. Of course, he wasn't really involved in the later aspects of the Madrid one because he ended up actually getting arrested in Istanbul in March 2003 and then being rendered back to Tunisia. And then he spent time in prison all the way up until the 2011 revolution. So Abu Ayyad, though, considered his prison time as one of the most important times in his life. He said, quote, "I consider the period of imprisonment as one of the best periods of my life in the matter of knowledge seeking and jihad." And he noted in some ways that unlike in Egypt and Libya and Morocco, where you had these ideological revisions within the jihadi movement in the prison system, that this never happened in Tunisia in sort of the 8 years prior to the revolution. He said, quote, "This is a merit for the jihadi current within Tunisia, which in many ways remained true to its own ideology." So between 2003 and 2010, the growth in the jihadi population in prison as a result of deportations, extraditions, as well as local arrests, whether from Europe or people who had been arrested in the context of trying to go to Iraq and being arrested in Syria, sort of connected the first generation of Tunisian jihadis to the second generation of Tunisian jihadis. those that had joined up in Afghanistan in the 80s or these networks in Europe in the 90s versus those who became more inspired by what was going on in Iraq after 2003, as well as the building up of AQIM's networks in Algeria next door in the latter half of the 2000s. And therefore, they're able to provide new opportunities to share experiences, lessons learned, as well as preparations for post-release activities. It was also where Abu Ayyad was able to further cement his role as a leader within this movement, because in many ways he hadn't been in the country for about 14 or 15 years between him leaving originally to go to Morocco, then being arrested and going to the prison system, and sort of what he called the battle of the call to prayer in prison. You know, obviously it's hard to know how legitimate or not some of these details are, but it's an interesting way of him saying how he cemented his role as a leader within this context, where he would do the call to prayer in prison, which allegedly was illegal within the prison system in Tunisia in 2003 and 2004, and he would get beaten up by the security forces by it. He allegedly claims he was almost actually killed. It's quite possible because the Tunisian prison system was notorious for torture. But over time, they relented and they were able to actually then do prayers together. And this then facilitated sort of time to come together and come up with strategic plans and ideas. And Hassan al-Brik, if you remember, the facilitator of foreign fighters from Syria and Iraq for AQI, and later then the head of AST's Dawah program, said at this time, quote, "Communal prayer time served as a forum for discussion or refining ideas that would put into practice upon release." And why upon release? This is because in 2006, the Tunisian government on the 50th anniversary of its independence actually let a number of Islamist members out of prison from Ennahda. And as a result, many individuals within the Tunisian jihadi movement in prison decided that, well, if they're getting out of prison, then I'm sure we will eventually as well. And I was able to get this from one of the 20 original members of AST. And therefore, from 2006 to 2011, they essentially were able to come up with ideas and plans for what they were going to do. And this is where sort of this Dawah first approach came about, which I discuss in my book in great depth, because if you look at what they did, they weren't involved in sort of the classical terrorist attacks right from the beginning. This was a result of a number of key factors, in particular, the lessons that Al-Qaeda network was learning at the time from the failures of the Iraq Jihad with Zarqawi and excessive violence, but also a series of internal sort of recollections, first by Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, who's considered one of the most important ideologues within the movement, who discussed this idea of protecting the jihad from these excesses, and a lot of it was talking about the importance of organization and education, as well as doing things that would help consolidate stuff instead of just hurting the enemy, but then that not leading to anything in the longer term. And therefore, this led him to create the Sharia Committee of Minbar al-Tawhid al-Jihad, which was a website he ran, and therefore people could ask for specific rulings based on a variety of topics, and therefore this was a legitimate way of understanding these issues and what individuals should do in these contexts. In the same way, Al-Qaeda also had this correctives of jihad, where they're putting out a variety of ideological pamphlets related to the issue of takfir, or excommunication, and not spilling Muslim blood needlessly. And they also started putting out a variety of sort of dawah videos, or videos related to Islam and the correct ways of interpreting things in sort of 2007, 2008 time period. Of course, at that time, because they weren't in control of territory or public squares weren't open up, a lot of this was very much theoretical. But with the opening of things in Tunisia, this then allowed things to be done in practice in many respects. So as a result, in the aftermath of the Tunisian revolution, strategic advice given by key leaders in Al-Qaeda branches, as well as respected ideologues in the movement, were trying to tell this movement in Tunisia specifically, as well as others in Libya and Egypt and elsewhere, how to take advantage of the new opportunities, and in this particular context with the overthrow of Ben Ali. And these are just some of the releases that they put out at that time in relation to this. So based off of this context, as well as Abu Ayyad's realizations that individuals needed to be educated in a true understanding of Islam, of course, according to AST, before Tunisia would be ripe for actual jihad. And there's a reason why I always say dawah first, because jihad second, or jihad later, however you want to describe it. And part of this goes back to the history of Tunisia, what I alluded to before with Habib Bourguiba and the secularization project, because many Tunisians didn't even know some, even a lot of the basics within Islam, and therefore he felt like this was an important part. So on the cusp of the revolution, there was therefore this golden age of jihadism as an opportunity to become ripe. But it was not necessarily guaranteed in many respects because they had been imprisoned. And this is where sort of what I call the original sin of the revolution comes in, which is the general amnesty in February 2011 comes in. Of course, legitimate political prisoners were let out, which I totally agree with and think should have happened. However, I think a smarter process should have been done for those who are convicted for terrorism-related issues, and this is the actual legal document from the government related to this general amnesty, which allowed out a number of these individuals. So at this time, about 1,200 individuals that had been jihadis were released, 300 who had previously fought in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, and Somalia. And because at the time the transitional government had little legitimacy, it really only focused on preparing the country for its forthcoming Constituent Assembly elections in October 2011. And this provided sort of the initial space for AST to grow and organize. So Abu Ayyad and Ansar al-Sharia had their first opening conference in May 2011, and this is a picture of him at it. I always find the video kind of ironic because the only place that reported on this was Al-Qura. If you can see, for those that know Arabic, I don't know, I just always found that kind of funny. But anyways, at this conference, and I think it sets the tone for the understanding of what Abu Ayyad and AST was trying to do at this time, he said, quote, "We were trying to save people from the black tunnel of the old regime that placed them in. We believe that prosperity comes from the governance of Sharia and that everything bad comes from following civil laws. Our dawah is to bring people back to salvation, and we will wait for no one to approve our message. We are not looking for elections or power, but our goal is to bring people back to faith." End quote. Things would change in terms of how the Tunisian government would deal with this movement after the Constituent Assembly elections in October 2011, when Ennahda was elected as the lead party alongside a coalition with two other secular left political parties, which they called the Troika. Even though they became more engaged in the transitional government, it gambled on sort of this, what I call light touch policy, which ended up failing. To sort of understand this, Hamidi al-Jabali, who was the prime minister of Tunisia at the time and a senior member of Ennahda, went as so far as to say about these individuals, quote, that these individuals are sons of Tunisia and they're not from Mars. So as a result, AST was able to successfully exploit Ennahda's soft power approach and further recruit and embed itself within society and sort of challenge then secular left intellectuals and artists, but even the Islamic legitimacy of Ennahda itself over time. Part of the reason Ennahda did this was because of their own history of being cracked down upon, which I briefly mentioned earlier, in the late 80s and early 1990s, and they felt, look, if we're now in control of the country about 15 years later, what would happen if we do this to these Al-Qaeda-like guys? Then maybe in another 15 years, then Al-Qaeda would be running in the country. So that would mean in 2025, then maybe Al-Qaeda would be the heads of the Tunisian government. So they felt that there was a need to do something a little bit differently. But because of this and the Dawah-first approach, it allowed AST to reach a broader audience than it would have been if they acted as more of a classic style, clandestine type organization that Al-Qaeda had been historically. And one of the funny things is when I was doing some initial research related to this, I actually wrote an article about some of these lessons learned and things related to Maqdisi and these issues, and AST actually reposted it on their Facebook page, and they didn't even say anything negative about it, they just said this is a report from an American researcher. So I felt like I was maybe on the right path since they didn't say anything negative about it, which was kind of funny at the time. So the specifics about this program and what these guys did. So here's a map of all the various activities or things related to them got involved with over time. Its activities were characterized by a number of opportunities for individuals to become involved, whether through outreach, religious education, or charitable relief efforts. And in the 2.5-year period where the organization was active, they conducted around about 900 discrete activities, or a little less than that. So just to show you sort of some examples of this, this is an example of one of their earlier charity convoys to one of the areas of rural Tunisia. So one of the things that they did is that they would start in an actual city or village and then go out to a more rural area and bring a variety of supplies to them. And therefore, in many ways, a lot of these charity and service activities were in the service of spreading the group's ideology, that because they also provided pamphlets and talk to them about their ideas as well. This is an example of their yearly conference. This is an example of more of a regular religious type of lecture, which they also did in addition to outside, but in mosques as well. And besides sort of religious lectures in mosques as well as normal praying, they also use it as a way to mobilize a lot of their resources in terms of getting prepared for a lot of their charity and dawah type of activities here, where you can see that there's food as well as a bunch of literature in some of these boxes as well. In addition to this, I don't know where the other pictures on the left side, but it's a picture of men, just to show the dichotomy of the fact that you had men involved in demonstrations as well as women separately. But essentially, they're able to do a bunch of demonstrations against the Tunisian government, but also calling for Tunisian foreign fighters who had been imprisoned abroad, especially in places like Iraq at the time, to get them to become released and return home. And the main reason I added the picture of the women involved in these activities is that you have to remember this is in 2011 and 12, before most people were even thinking about women being involved in the jihadi movement in the same way you saw with the Islamic State, and how a lot of people started to look into this more on the research level. And you could see in many ways sort of this through line between what we saw in Tunisia with Al Sharia, that one then translated into what we saw then in places like Syria and even Libya. And the fact that the Tunisian women were probably the largest grouping in many respects of Tunisian women, or of women overall, that went to become volunteers with the Islamic State in those two countries. It also helped in many respects that AST's message resonated with many individuals that were looking for something new post-revolution, especially in sort of the year after to the revolution, when people began to become more disillusioned by the slow process of democracy and transition, and not really seeing tangible results. Whereas, on the other hand, if you went to these AST events or following them on their official Facebook page, you could see that they were not just talking to talk, but they were doing this stuff on the ground as well. And so one of the narratives and ideas that they pushed out there was this idea of brotherhood. An AST member once explained how one of his friends joined the group, and he said, quote, "One day he came to me to see me to understand what was this special feeling that we shared. We are more than friends, we are brothers. We share ethics, and between us there is a special strength and solidarity," end quote. Additionally, when I met AST members, they actually were doing dawah on me. They were trying to convert me to Islam and have me join the group. It was quite interesting, but I could see as an outsider why somebody there might be captivated by their message, because the way that they were treating me, you could see somebody that actually was from there, that this could potentially be something that people would be involved in, because it provided them with this sort of fraternity and brotherhood that people might not have had alone, since many people still were not doing too well economically, even if they're all very well educated. It's also one of the reasons why I titled this book, "Your Sons Are at Your Service," which was one of the group's slogans, just because it had the power for those involved that they were doing something on behalf of the community, but also showed the community that they were giving back to them, and therefore provide this linkage between those involved and those on the ground. Another one was this idea of defending God in Islam, which is obviously self-explanatory, not surprising for the jihadi movement. But another thing that's interesting is this idea of building an Islamic State. And again, this is 2011 to 2013. So one of the slogans they used in the run-up to the second annual conference in May 2012 was a building block in the project to establish a caliphate state. Again, 2012. This is all before all this stuff with ISIS and people paying attention. And then a year later, for their third annual conference, they talked about the Islamic State we are building. And, you know, they show this in both of these examples here. So what happened in Tunisia in many respects from 2011 to 13 helps explain what subsequently happened with Tunisians that then joined with ISIS. In many ways, those that joined were primed by their experiences with AST. And furthermore, the final idea that they used in some of the argumentation was Duat Allah Baqiya, or the call of God remains. And for anybody that knows and studies ISIS, they use Baqiya a lot in their sloganeering. So you can see again these similarities. And so overall, these ideas provided the individual the perfect purpose that both benefited himself as well as encouraged solidarity amongst group members by helping them believe they are fulfilling God's promise and bettering their communities. And this incentivized in many ways individuals to remain active and encouraging members to join, even when the group came under fire from the state in the spring of 2013. Because of all this, there are also a number of interrelated processes related to the eventual fall of the group because they became so popular and strong, and sort of the return of foreign fighting as being sort of the main reason why people started to join the jihadi movement. In the end, Abu Ayyad was unable to manage what he described as the so-called stages between dawah and jihad, which allowed for a growth in violence even if the original intent was this dawah-first approach. As he once noted, quote, "In this period we're in the dawah phase without abandoning jihad as an obligation," end quote. The reality is, though, jihadi ideology is very much inherently violent, so it's not surprising that things ended up the way they're going. And we saw this in terms of the Nesma TV riots in the lead up to the 2011 Constituent Assembly elections, where the network showed the movie Persepolis, which showed an image of God which is considered blasphemous for many people, including jihadis, and therefore they rioted in front of the house of Nabil Karoui, who is the CEO of the channel and who recently actually ran for to become the head of Tunisian state. You also had the Manuba College Niqab protest, which you see here on the bottom left, which was part of the project that Mohamed Bakhti was involved in, whom I mentioned earlier. I actually had the opportunity to actually meet the dean of the school at Manuba College to talk about this, because they actually, at one point, held him hostage, the dean. Then you had the Avenue Bourguiba Sharia show of strength, which is obvious here, and also the basis of the cover of my book itself, because in many ways this was a turning point where a lot of people in the country were like, what is going on here? Where is this country going? And that's when you first started to see a pushback, especially from those on the secular left, and over time through a variety of violent activities, Ennahda would as well. So these are pictures of the attack on the U.S. Embassy that I was able to get from one of the members of Ansar al-Sharia, and as you can see in the top right corner, they actually rose the black flag up within the embassy property. In addition to this, we also had the assassination of the two leftist politicians in February and June 2013 of Shukri Belaid and Mohamed Brahmi. And the assassinations in many ways was the breaking point for Ennahda, which then led to the beginning of the crackdown against this group. The other issue besides these things was the fact that Abu Ayyad and AST also allowed its members to be involved in Hizbullah-related intimidation or violent assaults and tactics, essentially hurting people that were involved in drinking or violating Ramadan and eating them, or lighting Sufi shrines on fire because they felt that this was bid'ah or an innovation and against the sovereignty or oneness of God. In light of this, they also then created these first neighborhood committees, but then they called them security committees, first in October 2012, in the one-year anniversary of the Constituent Assembly election, because that was the original mandate for writing the Constitution. Of course, the Tunisian government extended it beyond that because they hadn't finished it, but AST was like, well, things might get chaotic, so we're going to create these committees. But then they activated them overtly in February 2013 in the aftermath of the assassination of Shukri Belaid. And as you can see from the pictures on the bottom here, that you had these marauding individuals through various cities and villages, and in the middle one you could see them having weapons, and some people were hurt or tortured, and there are even alleged cases of people being killed. As a result of all of this going on, Ennahda initially situated itself as sort of this moderating force between what it saw as a secular extremism on the left and a Salafi extremism on the right, but this mounting AST-related violence in the country, paired with sort of critiques from the left about Ennahda's complicity in all of this, forced the party to take issue more seriously. And we really started to see this when they didn't allow AST to have their third annual conference in May 2013. In response to this, Abu Ayyad released a video mocking Ennahda for allowing AST to even get this far in proselytizing their message. When he said, quote, "Our religion taught us to thank those who is worthy of being thanked, and you, Ennahda, today are the most worthy of people to be thanked, since you committed stupidities that were reason for the spread of our dawah," end quote. Then a few days later, Rashid Ghanouchi hit back and said, quote, "Wherever those jihadis, the Kharijites of this age, are, there is destruction and ruin. I challenge them to give me one state where those reckless people succeed. Are Somalia, Iraq, or Afghanistan stable countries?" And this speech in many ways illustrates this shift in Ennahda's way of framing things, but also their public descriptions of AST. But by this time, many Tunisians involved in the movement were already leaving to go to Libya, Iraq, and Syria. As a result of this, even Abu Ayyad, in the aftermath of the designation in late August 2013, and snuck out of Tunisia to go to Libya in October 2013. But because they had this Dawah strategy at home, that doesn't mean he abandoned this idea of jihad, which they pushed more abroad. And one of the interesting quotes Abu-Ayyad said in February 2013 was, quote, "Tunisians can be found everywhere in the land of jihad. The ways of going are easy, and we don't stop our people from leaving," end quote. And in my own experiences, when I was at AST mosques, after the normal prayers that the members would do, they actually would do these special du'at or blessings for the so-called mujahideen in Bilad al-Sham, or Greater Syria. In addition to this, you saw in their own propaganda, they put out a nasheed for Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, who's the leader of Jabhat al-Nusra, as well as signs supporting Jabhat al-Nusra at the time. And even Tunisians that had already gone to Syria and died there, they would put out martyrdom notices related to them at the time. In addition to sort of failing to manage the stages between Dawah and Jihad within Tunisia, though, Abu-Ayyad in many ways also helped pave the way for Tunisians to join ISIS in Syria over Al-Qaeda or Jabhat al-Nusra at the time. Part of this was related to Abu-Ayyad's own background. When he was in Afghanistan, he actually met and was close to Zarqawi at the time. But also, I think it's important that we don't project back into that period sort of what we know now about the fight between ISIS and Al-Qaeda, because in 2013 it wasn't quite as concrete. So in the summer of 2013, when we first started seeing these things, Abu-Ayyad said, quote, "AST announces that it has not officially declared its position regarding the disagreement between ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra. But because of this, other individuals would then fill this vacuum, whether Abu Ja'far al-Khattab, who was on the Sharia committee of the group, Kamal Zarruq, who was one of the top religious figures in AST, Bilal al-Shawashi, who was a major agitator on the streets and recruiting people, as well as Abu Bakr al-Hakim." And here is one of the releases from Kamal Zarruq telling people to pledge bayat to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And the bottom is a Facebook post from Bilal al-Shawashi essentially saying the same thing. Furthermore, Abu-Ayyad was relatively aloof about the various debates, especially as it related to the idea of the caliphate being raised by those sympathetic to ISIS and challenging AQ in the run-up to the actual announcement. In early May 2014, for example, Abu-Ayyad explained, quote, "Regarding the conversation about the caliphate based on the prophetic methodology is very early, and the time for this conversation has not come yet. And I don't think it will happen during our time or even the time of our grandsons. This is not pessimism, but I see that these conversations need a scientific study that will look at the chronological order of events in order for us to understand where we are today." Only a month and a half later, ISIS announces that it has a caliphate. So you can see in many ways Abu-Ayyad was already out of touch and step with a lot of these individuals. In addition to this, in the aftermath of the takeover of Mosul, Abu-Ayyad released a statement saying that he was inspired by these conquests. And then after the caliphate announcement, Abu-Ayyad actually sent 2 different letters to Ayman al-Zawahiri at the time. The first suggested that Zawahiri should actually pledge bayat to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. As a reminder, this is 5 months after Al-Qaeda put out a statement saying that they had nothing to do with ISIS and they were kicked out of the Al-Qaeda organization. Abu-Ayyad was proposing that Zawahiri would attempt to moderate ISIS from within itself by stifling its more extreme tendencies and therefore save them from themselves. However, in a second letter written in mid-August 2014, just a month and a half after the caliphate announcement, Abu-Ayyad then told Zawahiri to rescind and ignore his original letter, saying, quote, "Consider my proposal and advice as if it had never existed," end quote. Apparently, in that short amount of time, he realized that there was no longer, quote, "reasons for giving the benefit of the doubt to the good people among them." By this time, however, about 2,500 or so of the 3,000 Tunisians that were going to Syria to join up with the jihadi movement and ISIS in particular had already arrived in Iraq and Syria. So it was kind of irrelevant in many respects. And even by that point, many of these individuals would not have listened to Abu-Ayyad then, because ISIS was already tarring him online by calling him a Jew of jihad in the same way that they did with other Al-Qaeda leaders at the time. It also helped that IS's Dawah activities and messaging resonated based off of individuals' past experiences with AST. Many Tunisians actually helped build up IS's Dawah program based off of their own experiences. And Abu Aqqas al-Tunisi became the face in many respects of IS's Dawah program, appearing in 6 of its videos online by the end of 2013. And therefore, this would resonate with many AST recruits who felt that their mission in Tunisia had only just begun and that they would eventually spread their Dawah globally. And this is interesting because back in 2012, a member of AST I interviewed actually said this, quote, "Dawah is going on, and then after it is global, not just in Tunisia." Of course, it's possible I could be reading into into it because these guys put out and talk about propaganda all the time, but it is interesting in that context, looking back. It is no surprise then that IS's Voice of Shah magazine in September 2013 featured a picture of Abu Waqas, as well as the believers are but brothers idea, which is a Quranic verse, but was used as a slogan by ISIS, as well as Ansar al-Sharia. And the top one was a post of Ansar al-Sharia where they're pushing one of their charity caravans, but you could see how there was this synergy in some ways in a lot of the same messaging, which appealed and was part of the same framing devices that AST used. While this soft approach appealed to some, a more extreme approach also attracted others, especially after an activist crackdown, which radicalized a number of Tunisians. And therefore, Tunisians became in this ultra-extremist trend within ISIS called the Hazamis, which is named after Ahmed bin Umar al-Hazmi, who is a Saudi religious scholar that believes in this idea of chain takfir. Essentially, if you yourself don't do takfir on somebody who is a non-believer, then you yourself get takfir essentially, and therefore your blood is legitimate too. And al-Hazmi did 4 different lecture series in Tunisia and actually opened up the Ibn Abu Zayd al-Kirawani Institute for Sharia Sciences between December 2011 and May 2012, in coordination with AST's cleric named Abu Muhammad al-Tunisi. And Hazmi's works were also part of AST's curriculum, which is right here, which shows a number of works, including ones from guys like Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi. Thus illustrating another failure of Abu Waqas's leadership in the end, because this then primed these individuals to more so be involved with this extremist end of things with ISIS. So what ended up happening to Abu Waqas then? There hasn't been too many details about him in the 5 intervening years since the designation of the group in 2013 or so, until there are credible reports that he was killed by the French in a drone strike in Mali in February 2019. A video leaked, however, online in December 2016 showing the AST leader praying over the dead body of Muhammad al-Zahawi, who is the leader and founder of Ansar al-Sharia in Libya, which happened in Benghazi in late 2014. The United States also claimed to have killed Abu Waqas, which we know was false then, in June 2015 in Ajdabiya, Libya. But based off of credible reports, Abu Waqas actually fled Darna, Libya in the spring of 2016 to Mali, meaning before he was killed by the French, for about 2.5 years, he was fighting in Mali alongside AQIM, or their new group, which they call JNIM. So in many ways, he has this complicated legacy where he was involved in a lot of building up these Tunisian networks in the 90s, as well as a lot of these reforms that happened within the broader al-Qaeda movement. And in many ways, having a successful group in Tunisia for the 2.5-year period, but he also provided the space to then let ISIS fill a vacuum, and many of these Tunisian jihadis that became involved with AST actually to then be involved with ISIS. So essentially, he was the one who helped build the infrastructure, and ISIS just took advantage of it in many respects. And therefore, even to this day, most Tunisians are probably more pro-ISIS than pro-Al-Qaeda at this juncture. Either way, it's my hope that this research will allow others in the field to better understand sort of the reasons why Tunisian jihadi got involved with AST, as well as ISIS in Iraq, Syria, Libya, and the underlying processes that led to it. And then hopefully people can build upon all this research later on as things go on from here. But just leave it at that for now, and I look forward to your questions. So thanks, guys.
Aaron, that was very, very insightful. I've heard you speak about your book before, and I am always learning new things every time we go through, so thank you so much. I think one thing that was really interesting to me as I was listening to this talk again, and as I read the book, was you were discussing the generational divide. So we have the first generation versus the second generation, and we almost now have a third generation. And you touched on this a bit, but I'd love if you could go more in depth about the clash between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, what that means for the third generation, and how they relate back then to the first and second generation.
Yeah, in many ways, what we saw with the Islamic State in 2013 and 14 and challenging Al-Qaeda is you sort of had, obviously it's not a complete distinction, but you had a bunch of millennials being like, okay, boomer to Al-Qaeda. And therefore, what will be interesting going forward with this third generation sort of came of age in the last 8 or 9 years in relation to Syria in particular is how they react to the losses of ISIS over the last few years, whether they become more extreme and follow sort of this Hazmi trend that we've been seeing, or they sort of go back and there's sort of this medium thing between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, or you see people going in a whole other direction with what we've seen more with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria, which essentially has said that they're no longer an Al-Qaeda affiliate. Of course, there are still linkages between individuals, between them, but this is also another third way. And depending on what could happen going forward, I think a lot of that will decide many of these things, especially depending on this dynamic and Idlib going on now. I mean, if Turkey is able to push back against Russia and is able to consolidate sort of this enclave in Idlib for a longer term, and what some people are calling like a Gazification of Idlib, this model where essentially you have this jihadist administration being run could be a new model, which essentially the international community just accepts because there are too many civilians there to do anything otherwise, even if many of the civilians themselves don't like the way things are going. So it'll be interesting because, I mean, you know, when you look at the history of the movement in many ways, you have individuals sort of going against prior iterations. So one of the reasons why Al-Qaeda was actually created in the first place is because many individuals were not happy with Azam and the Service Bureau in the 80s because they felt like they're too corrupted or they're relying too much on the Afghan Mujahideen, and therefore they wanted to reform things. So even back in the late 80s, you had these types of dynamics going on. So I imagine we'll see things going forward. And then, of course, what will be interesting too is what the dynamic with everything going on in the Sahel region now. Of course, it's beyond my own specific specialization because I focus mainly on the Arab world. But because it is outside of the Arab world, there are different cultures and different histories than the way things happen within the Arab context and the way these movements grew in from like sort of the localized opportunities in the 60s and 70s through more of the globalization movement in the 80s and 90s. So I think that'll be another flashpoint in seeing sort of the trajectory of this, because for many in the Sahel region, this is their first generation in many ways.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it also, I mean, talking about Idlib and talking about, you know, what is currently happening over there is really important because it talks about, you know, Tunisians joined and went to Syria and Iraq at higher rates than most other communities. And so there is this whole FTF community, including, you know, generations of men, women, and children who are over there. What do you think that means for this generation? Do you think we're going to see the same things we saw from the jihadi, the going back to home countries, staying in, you know, conflict areas, going to a new conflict? What do you think is next?
It's hard to predict these things, obviously. I think that the heart of the movement is still very much in Iraq and Syria. I think people are always trying to look for the next big thing, but at least for ISIS, because it's from Iraq and now Syria as well, and the fact that they probably still are pretty much one of the strongest jihadi groups, even if they're a lot more weakened than they had been a few years ago, is that the heart of the movement is still very much there just because of all of the various significance to that region within the Arab world too, historically and religiously as well. Depending on what happens with this alleged peace deal with the Taliban, that also could open things up in Afghanistan as well, even though the Taliban says that they're not going to allow Al-Qaeda to do anything. I'm quite skeptical of this, since Al-Qaeda members are actually in units with the Taliban fighting against the Afghan government and U.S. and coalition forces. So that's one thing to think about as well. We've seen people traveling from Iraq and Syria that have been able to get out to other conflict zones, whether very small numbers to the Sinai, larger numbers in the 2014 to 17 timeframe to Libya, as well as some people making it all the way out to the Philippines. So you'll see trickles, but again, I think Syria is quite unique just because of the variety of factors that lend so many people to go there at the time, whether it was related to it being in the context of the Arab uprisings in 2011, the ease of travel into Turkey to get into Syria, as well as all the various important ideological factors and sectarian factors as well, specific to Syria and Iraq too, which aren't necessarily the case in other locations. So I think that even if things aren't quite as large as they were in like 2013 to 16 or so, I still think Iraq and Syria are very much important.
Thank you. I have more questions, but I'd love to open it to the floor. Yes.
Thank you. Aaron, great presentation. Tom Sanderson, former Director of Transnational Threats at CSIS. I love watching the pictures and the work you did. It reminds me of the trip High Milk and I made there, down to Karawan and Sousse, and it was really remarkable. Two questions. I know it's never good to get hung up on the numbers, but what is the range that you use for Tunisians who traveled abroad since 2011, 2012 to Syria and Iraq? And number two, can you talk a little bit about the role of women in the Al-Khanza Brigade inside of ISIS, inside the Islamic State?
Yeah. So in terms of the first question, for me, I honestly think that only around 3,000 people ended up actually making it. I find the Tunisian government's numbers quite credible. I don't know where the 6,000 figure ever came from. The only place I ever saw it was in this random Wall Street Journal article, which didn't actually cite or quote anybody, and then people ran with it. The 4,500 number, I understand. That's because it's a combination of Iraq, Syria, and Libya, because there was about 1,500 Tunisians that went to Libya. So I get that one, but obviously it's important to note which was Iraq and Syria versus Libya. So that one makes more sense, but the 6,000 number never made sense to me. However, it's important to note that the Tunisian government did stop 27,000 people from traveling to go. Of course, they did this in the context of essentially if you're a male that's the ages of 18 to 35. So they could have stopped people who are just going to Turkey for normal tourism reasons or work or something else. So, the 27,000 number sounds like a lot, but I'm unsure it represents that every single person amongst that grouping was an actual potential foreign fighter, and the fact that there are a lot of civil society groups and humanitarian organizations that sort of question this law that was implemented related to this at the time. In terms of the Al-Khanza Brigade and the Tunisian women involved, as I discussed in the book, and there's a lot more detail about it than I can probably remember off the top of my head, but the actual founder of the Al-Khanza Brigade was Rayyan al-Tunisi, which was this Tunisian woman. I don't know her actual real name or what her background was, but she helped build it up in the beginning. And she actually also then later on traveled from Syria to Libya to help build it up in the Libyan context when they're starting things there as well. So they had an outstretched role in many respects in this. And she was actually involved in some of the torture against the Jordanian pilot Muazzez al-Kasasba before he was obviously lit on fire, because the person who actually captured him after he was shot down was another Tunisian male fighter, and he actually had his arm around him. So the Tunisians were involved in a lot of these various activities, but I get into a lot more details specifically in the book and about other Tunisian women as well. So it's something that I'm hoping to dig deep into as a future project beyond just what was in the book, just because there's a lot more stuff that it didn't include, just because the book was as long as it is, very detailed as it was. So hopefully I'll have more about that in the near term, or probably more medium to long term actually. But
very quickly, does the F-16 appear there because of the Kasasba shooting, or?
Oh no, that picture is for the AQIM release that came out last week, announcing the death of Abu Ayyab, as well as a number of other figures in AQIM/JNIM. I think that's just representing the fact that the French did an airstrike against these individuals to kill them in Mali. So.
Anyone else?
Can you elaborate on the killing of the two politicians, Bali and Rami, and whether that might have been an international network, since Bakar al-Hakim wasn't a long time in Tunisia?
Yeah, so in terms of the assassination of the two Tunisian politicians in the spring and summer of 2013, it was an international network insofar as Bakar al-Hakim was actually based in Sabratha, Libya, where they created a training camp. This was a training camp that ISIS then took over from Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia and Libya when they took control of sort of the networks in Libya. And this is where a number of people trained to be involved in the assassinations. There's this guy, Kamal Ghazghazi, who did one of the assassinations, and then Bakr al-Hakim did the other one himself. But it was also where these guys trained that were involved in this plot in October 2013 to do an attack in Mahdia and Sousse, even though most people don't remember it. They're trying to kill tourists in the one in Sousse. So in some ways it was a precursor to what we saw in June 2015. And then the other one was against Bourguiba's mausoleum, which they stopped. So there was this sort of external operations planning aspect of what AST's military wing was doing on the Libyan side of the border. Beyond that, it's hard to say. There's some circumstantial evidence that maybe there was some connections to AQIM as well as the Islamic State of Iraq, just because of the broader connections between AST and AQIM, but also the fact that Abu Bakr al-Hakim had previously been with ISIS in Iraq in the previous years. But a lot of it's circumstantial. It's hard to know the specifics. At most, it might have been some help with funding, but again, it's not 100% confirmed. But basically, it was mainly more of this Tunisian Libyan network, since both groups, Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia and Ansar al-Sharia in Libya, were essentially sister organizations working together in many respects.
Another question. So talking about the Dawah first, Jihad second. So obviously this is a Tunisian-based and focused, and this was brought over in the cooperation when Tunisian individuals joined AQ Central or IS. But what do you think that will mean for this third? I'm very stuck on this third generation, so I apologize. But when Tunisians do return to Tunisia, what do you think that will mean for, the groups in Tunisia, Jihad in Tunisia?
Well, I mean, it's illegal to be involved in any jihadi organization in Tunisia now, so there is no ability to operate openly in that manner. So the only type of mobilization people can do is related to violent activity, and that's primarily just the small cells of individuals that still remain on the border near Algeria and the mountainous regions. But again, it's important to note that those cells, both from AQIM and ISIS, are extremely weakened, and the Tunisian government has essentially deterred them for now, since there are probably, maybe less than 50 people, even in both groups together at this juncture, based off of figures from the Tunisian government. So the only way to get involved in more of this dawah or charity type activity would be potentially to be with a group that's in some area where they control the territory and are doing administration. So there is a potential for people to do that in northwest Syria and Idlib now, though there are less Tunisians involved with HTS or Hurasadin there than say with ISIS. So there are some Tunisians, but it's a smaller version. But about 1,000 Tunisians have actually returned to Tunisia, and a lot of them are not actually imprisoned. Part of this is because the Tunisian government, when people return, they would interview them and sort of do a bunch of risk assessments on them. And the fact that you haven't really seen much happening over the last few years suggests that they have a pretty good idea of who these people are and understanding the risk. And also the fact, people talk about, this many people return, but not every single person that returns wants to be involved anymore because they're disillusioned by the experience or just traumatized in many respects. The bigger question for me going forward, especially related to Tunisia, is what happens with the prisoner population. Because you see the same dynamics in the prison population now that you saw prior to 2011, where essentially in the same way you see with gangs running prisons in inner cities in the United States, the jihadis essentially are doing that in prisons within Tunisia now. There's also no separation between jihadi prisoners or sort of petty criminals. Therefore, this could be places for recruitment. But also, even if they are trying to do pilot programs within the prison system for rehabilitation and reintegration, because you have these networks, there's this huge peer pressure dynamic going on. So it makes it a lot harder to then actually get somebody out and involved. But I will give a lot of credit to the Tunisian government in terms of what they're doing outside the prison system, in terms of providing contracts to a number of associations to help out with sort of prevention on the front end as well as reintegration on the back end. And what's interesting is that they're also implementing an evaluation or a monitoring and evaluation component, which people talk about in some ways, but they're actually trying to do it in a real way. And what's interesting is that at the end of January this year, there was actually this workshop between people on the National Counterterrorism Committee, as well as associations and some international organizations were helping teach them how to do monitoring and evaluation in a real manner, which suggests that the government is actually taking this seriously, and it's not just lip service to the donors who are helping fund some of these, which is places like USAID or other European similar entities. And then the thing too is that over the past year and a half, this counterterrorism committee, as part of the presidency, has been doing workshops in every single governorate, not just the coastal areas, with local associations, local politicians, local social workers, psychologists, religious leaders, about how to deal with reintegrating people and what that means, which is important because at least people that have done research on this, an important part of it is building up this alternative social network in comparison to the jihadi social network, and so that people can feel like they're part of society again and get their feedback and move on with their lives in many respects after they've done the prison sentences. So, of course, a lot of this is in very early stages, so it's hard to know how much this will work in the medium to long term. But the fact that Tunisia is actually doing this and being serious about it, I think is a good thing. And I think it helps that they are the only Arab democracy, so they can be a lot more dynamic. They don't need to worry about activists saying anything negative about the government, because if you look at any of the social media or news in Tunisia, it's very anti-government most of the time. But because of that, they can be more dynamic and actually use the power of civil society to do these things in comparison to, say, like in Egypt, where any type of thing like that would never happen, just because they'd be too paranoid that this would give any space to any activism which could hurt the regime there. So even if I worry about the prison population as well as those that remain in northeast Syria under the custody of the SDF, and what that could mean in the future if ISIS ever tried to break them out or something along those lines. In terms of what the government has been doing the last 2 or 3 years, I am a bit more hopeful in comparison to, say, how they're acting from like 2011 to 2015 or so, where it was quite amateurish in many respects.
It's actually a very positive note to end on, unless there's any final questions. But I think a bit of optimism is a good way of ending this. Thank you so much for being here today and sharing your book. Again, you can get 30% off if you pick up one of these flyers on your way out. And please join me in thanking Dr. Aaron Zelin.